Over the past few years, I've started paying attention to two emotions that seem to appear whenever something feels wrong: anger and guilt. For a long time, I thought they were simply emotions to overcome, something to calm down or something to get rid of. But the more I watched them, the less convinced I became that they were the problem. They began reminding me of physical pain. Pain doesn't tell me exactly what's wrong, it simply tells me that something deserves my attention. And I've started wondering whether anger and guilt might be doing something similar. Perhaps anger quietly says something outside you has fallen out of balance, and guilt whispers something inside you has. Neither seems particularly interested in making me suffer. They seem much more interested in making me look. That surprised me because if they're only pointing, then perhaps I've been confusing the sign for the thing it's pointing toward. I've noticed that guilt doesn't always lead to the same place. Sometimes I apologize, I repair something I had been avoiding, sometimes I finally tell the truth and somehow the guilt passes. Other times it doesn't. I replay the same conversation, the same mistake, the same regret again and again. Nothing changes except my suffering, which makes me wonder whether guilt was never asking me to suffer. Perhaps it was asking me to see. The strange thing is that seeing turns out to be much harder than I expected. Sometimes I carry guilt for things that were never mine. Someone is disappointed, someone is hurt, someone doesn't understand me, and somehow I begin carrying their experience as though it belongs to me. Other times I avoid guilt altogether. I say things like I had no choice, they deserved it, I was only joking. At first, those two responses seemed completely different, but the more I watched them, the more they seemed to come from the same place. In one case, I carry more than belongs to me, and then in the other, I carry less. Either way, I've drifted away from something. And that word stayed with me. Drifted. In the last episode, I found myself thinking about a sailor. A sailor never controls the wind, but he keeps returning to his direction. Not because the sea stops changing, but because without direction, every adjustment becomes meaningless. And I started wondering if something similar might be happening inside us. Perhaps anger and guilt aren't trying to steer the ship, perhaps they're simply telling me I've drifted. That thought reminded me of something from the very beginning of this series. When we live at the tip of the pendulum, movement begins to look like identity. One success quietly becomes "this is who I am," and one failure becomes "this is who I am." Maybe guilt becomes unbearable the moment I stop asking what happened and begin answering "this is what I am." If that's true, then I'm no longer carrying responsibility for an action, I'm carrying responsibility for defining myself. And that feels like trying to carry the wind itself, a responsibility that never belonged to me. And the more I sat with that, the more another image appeared, almost like an internal accounting department. Not one obsessed with numbers, but one quietly comparing my actions with the values I claim to live by. Almost like a navigator checking a compass, not asking, "Did you succeed?" but asking, "Are we still heading in the direction we chose?" Perhaps that's what conscience is. Not a voice trying to shame me, but a quiet invitation to remember. Then almost without realizing it, that image became a scale. And once I saw it, I kept seeing it everywhere. A while ago, I made a list comparing different countries I might want to live in. Community, nature, safety, opportunity, cost of living. I kept hoping I'd eventually discover the place where the scale disappeared. The place that offered everything. Instead, every country simply arranged the weights differently. One gave me more nature. Another gave me more opportunity. One offered belonging. Another offered freedom. Nothing removed the scale. Everything simply invited another balance. That observation stayed with me because I started wondering whether life itself works the same way. Perhaps we're not being asked to escape the scale, perhaps we're being asked to learn how to carry it. And if that's true, then maybe justice isn't what I thought it was. For a long time I imagined justice as punishment, or reward. But a scale isn't interested in either. It quietly reveals where balance has been lost, and perhaps justice is simply the movement that restores it, not revenge, not condemnation, restoration. That made me look differently at the way I judge myself. I've noticed that after making a mistake, I often skip straight to the verdict. Sometimes I'm only the prosecutor. Every mistake becomes a proof that I've failed. Other times I'm only the defense. Every mistake immediately finds an excuse. Very rarely do I become the judge, the one who listens, who investigates, who allows evidence to emerge before reaching a conclusion. The purpose of a courtroom isn't to confirm what it already believes, it's to discover what is true. And I began wondering how often my own judgments are really attempts to protect an identity I've already chosen. I've also noticed something else. Sometimes I keep feeling guilty, almost as though the guilt itself has become my accountability. If I suffer long enough, perhaps the account has been settled. But nothing has actually changed. Nothing has been repaired. No truthful movement has been made. The scale hasn't moved, only my suffering has. And anger seems capable of something similar. Sometimes it quietly points toward a boundary that has been crossed, an injustice, a betrayal, something that genuinely deserves my attention. But sometimes, before conscience had a chance to speak, anger reaches the verdict first. The other quietly becomes an enemy, and once someone becomes an enemy, almost anything begins to feel justified. I stop asking what is true and I begin asking, how do I win? Maybe that's why we sometimes use truth to become cruel or justice to become violent. When I become convinced that my survival depends on being right, my conscience quietly loses its voice. The more I noticed that, the more another question appeared. Why is forgiveness sometimes so difficult? At first I thought it was because I couldn't let go of the other person's actions, but I'm beginning to wonder if something else comes first. I've noticed that whenever forgiveness feels impossible, acceptance usually feels impossible too. Part of me is still arguing with reality itself. This shouldn't have happened. They shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have made that mistake. As long as reality remains unacceptable, nothing seems able to move. And perhaps acceptance isn't agreeing that something was good. Perhaps it's simply allowing reality to be real. Only then does another feeling seem to become possible. Grief. And not that grief of giving up, the grief of finally allowing reality to touch me. I've started wondering whether tears are something like rain, not because they erase pain, but because they soften the ground. And perhaps forgiveness grows the same way trees do, not because I decide to grow one, but because the soil finally becomes capable of receiving it. Maybe denying grief also means denying beauty, denying connection, denying the shared vulnerability that makes another human being feel human again. Without that connection, the enemy remains an enemy, and condemnation begins to feel like justice. There was one final observation I couldn't seem to let go of. Whenever I judge myself, or someone else, I often behave as though my judgment is the final one, as though this single moment defines the whole story. But how could I possibly know that? I can't even fully account for my own intentions or my fears or the countless things shaping a single decision. And maybe that's why I've always found the word redemption interesting. To redeem, to deem again. Not because the truth changes, but because the judgment wasn't final. Because one truthful movement, an honest apology, the courage to repair, the willingness to meet reality instead of resisting it, can completely change the meaning of everything that came before. Not by erasing the past, but by completing something that had remained unfinished. Perhaps redemption is what frees us from believing that any single moment deserves the final word. Looking back, I'm no longer sure this episode was ever about anger, or guilt, or forgiveness. They seem more like signs, quiet invitations asking me to look again, to notice when I've drifted, to remember the direction I chose. And perhaps that's what truth has been doing all along, not trying to condemn me, not trying to shame me, but continually inviting me back into alignment, back toward the balance that seems woven into reality itself. Maybe that's the rhythm I've been watching, a rhythm of truth. One movement quietly restoring the balance, the other quietly restoring the relationship, justice and compassion. And perhaps my role was never to become the final judge. Perhaps it was simply to keep correcting my course, to tell the truth as honestly as I can, to carry what truly belongs to me, to repair what can be repaired, and to trust that the final weighing of the scales belongs to the one who sees what I never could.